On a mountain at the edge of the known world, a being who cannot die is chained to bare rock, and every day a great eagle comes down out of the sky, and tears open his side and feasts upon his liver, and every night the wound closes, and the liver grows whole again, so that the agony is never once finished and never once new. This has gone on, when our story begins, for longer than any mortal kingdom has stood. And here is the strange part, the part that makes this story different from every other punishment in the old myths. He could end it in a single sentence. He holds, locked inside his own silence, one piece of knowledge that the king of all the gods wants more desperately than he has ever wanted anything, a secret that could save Zeus from the one fate Zeus fears above every other fate there is. Speak it, and the chains fall away, and the eagle never comes again, and the mountain forgets his name. He will not speak it. Not for freedom, not to end the pain, not even, in some tellings, when his own torment stretches on for 30,000 years. Why would anyone choose an eternity of being devoured over a single sentence that would end it? To understand a mind capable of that kind of refusal, we must go back before the punishment, before the theft that caused it, back to the last days of the old world, when a Titan looked at a race of trembling, cold, and dying creatures crouched in the dark, and felt something none of the other gods had ever quite managed to feel for them. He felt pity. And pity, in this story, would turn out to be the most expensive thing a god ever chose to keep. His name was Prometheus, and the name itself was already a kind of prophecy. For in the old tongue it means forethought, the one who sees what is coming before it arrives. He had a brother, Epimetheus, whose name meant precisely the opposite, afterthought, the one who understands only once the moment has already passed and the damage is already done. The two of them were sons of the Titan Iapetus, cousins to the great Olympian family, born into the last generation of the old order, before the gods of Olympus rose up to claim the heavens for themselves. When that war came, the long and earth-shaking war between the young gods and the ancient Titans, a war so vast it tore mountains from their roots and boiled the sea in its wake, most of the Titans stood with their own kind, loyal to the old world even as it burned around them. But Prometheus did not. He looked at the two sides, gathering for that final, ruinous struggle, and with the clear sight his very name promised, he understood something the others could not or would not see, that the old order was already finished, whatever anyone chose to do about it, and that the future, however it came, belonged to Zeus and his brothers and sisters. So, Prometheus crossed the battle lines before the first blow fell, and stood with the young gods against his own kin, and helped them win a war that would have destroyed him, along with every other Titan, had he stayed loyal to the losing side. It was the first great act of foresight in his long story, and it should, by any ordinary reckoning, have bought him a permanent and honored place among the new masters of the world. For a time, it did. When the fighting ended and the defeated Titans were cast down into the deep dark of Tartarus to be chained there forever, Prometheus alone, among his whole vast family, walked free, welcomed, however cautiously, into the new order he had helped to build. He should have been safe. He should have been comfortable. He should have simply enjoyed the long, easy peace of a Titan who had backed the winning side. But comfort, it turns out, was never quite what Prometheus wanted, and safety was never the thing he was built to protect. For into this new world, freshly won and freshly ordered, something was missing, and Prometheus, more than any of the young gods, busy dividing up the sky, and the sea, and the underworld between themselves, noticed the gap. The world had mountains and oceans and forests now, and creatures of every kind moving through them. But there was, as yet, no creature that could look up at the stars and wonder what they were. Some of the old tellings say it was Prometheus himself, working with clay and water in the quiet years after the war, who shaped the first human beings, kneeling at a riverbank and modeling small, upright figures in the image of the gods themselves, breathing into them through some art or magic only a titan of forethought could have managed, a spark of reason that no beast anywhere else in creation possessed. Other tellings say the gods together made the first mortals, and that Prometheus was simply given charge of them afterward, appointed their guardian and their advocate in the halls of Olympus, the one titan whose particular task, among all the tasks divided out after the war, was to watch over this new and fragile species and see that it did not perish before it had properly begun. Either way, the outcome was the same. Of every being in the whole wide unfolding creation, mortal humankind became, quietly and almost by accident, Prometheus's particular concern. And he looked at them, these first trembling people, cold and slow and weak beside the lions and the wolves and the great tusked boars that already ruled the forests, without claws, without fur thick enough for winter, without any of the natural weapons that every other creature carried into the world at birth, and where the other gods, looking at the same sight, saw simply one more minor species among 1,000 others, Prometheus felt something rarer and more dangerous. He felt tenderness. He felt, looking at these fumbling, freezing, unprotected creatures, something close to what a parent feels looking at a child too small yet to survive on its own. And that feeling, once it had taken root in a titan old enough and clear-sighted enough to act on it without flinching, would not let him rest until he had done something about it. At first his help was quiet and small, and largely unnoticed by the busy new gods above. He taught the first mortals how to read the rising and setting of the stars, so that they could mark the turning of the seasons and know when to plant and when to gather before the frost came. He taught them the rudiments of counting, and of building, and of medicine, which roots eased a fever, and which berries would kill the one who ate them. Knowledge that meant the difference, in those hard first years, between a village that survived a hard winter and one that did not. He is even said to have taught them the art of augury, of reading the meaning hidden in the flight of birds and the shape of a flame, so that mortals might have some small window, however narrow, into the intentions of the gods who ruled so completely over their fragile lives. All of this he gave freely and quietly, and none of it at first troubled Zeus especially, for it seemed a small kindness, the sort of gentle stewardship a guardian naturally offers the creatures placed in his care. But there was one gift still ungiven, one gift that separated the merely helped from the truly capable, and it is here that the story turns from kindness into rebellion. There came a day, the old tellings say, when the gods and mortals gathered together at a place called Mecone, to settle for all time exactly what portion of a sacrificed animal belonged to the gods above, and what portion mortals might rightfully keep for their own table. And it fell to Prometheus, as the recognized advocate of humankind, to divide the offering. So he took a great ox, and he divided its slaughtered body into 2 separate piles, and here his cleverness, which had already won a war for the gods, turned itself for the first time squarely against them. In one pile he set the good meat, the rich and nourishing flesh of the animal, but he disguised it wrapping it inside the plain, unappetizing stomach of the ox, so that it looked, from the outside, like the poorer and less desirable portion. In the other pile, he set the bones, stripped of any meat at all, but he wrapped these in a thick and gleaming layer of white fat, so that this second pile looked, to any eye, judging only by appearance, like the richer and more generous offering by far. Then he stepped back, and he asked Zeus, king of all the gods, to choose which portion the immortals would take for themselves from that day forward, and which portion mortals would keep forever after as their rightful due. And Zeus, seeing the gleaming fat and choosing on the strength of what looked, to any reasonable eye, like the greater gift, chose the bones. Notice, if you will, exactly what this trick reveals about the god who fell for it, and about the Titan who set it. It was not strength that Zeus was tricked by, and not force. It was appearance, the simple, ancient human weakness for the thing that looks richest rather than the thing that truly is. And Prometheus, who understood mortals so well precisely because he had spent so long quietly studying them, understood the gods no less clearly, and knew exactly what kind of bait a proud and powerful king could never resist. Some of the old poets tell us that Zeus was not truly fooled at all, that the king of the gods, all-seeing as he was, understood perfectly well which pile held the meat and which held the bones, and chose the bones anyway, on purpose precisely, so that he would have an excuse, ready and waiting, for the fury he already intended to unleash. If this reading is true, then the trick at Mecone was never really a trick at all. It was a pretext. Zeus wanted a reason to punish this Titan, who had grown too fond of mortals, too generous with his gifts, too willing to arm a fragile and lesser species with the beginnings of real knowledge. And Prometheus, in his cleverness, simply handed him one, wrapped, fittingly enough, in a layer of gleaming and misleading fat. Whichever version you believe, the outcome was the same, and it fell with its full weight not upon Prometheus, who had devised the trick, but upon the very mortals he had been trying to protect. From that day onward, Zeus decreed, humankind would eat the meat of every sacrifice for themselves, and the gods above would receive only the bones and the fat burned upon the altar, which is, the old tellings note almost as an aside, precisely why the smoke of sacrifice rises to heaven and the meal remains below, an arrangement that shaped the religious life of the Greeks for every century that followed, and that had its whole beginning in a single act of Titan mischief on behalf of hungry mortals. But the settling of the meat was only the opening move. Zeus's true anger was not really about an ox at all. It was about what this small victory of humankind's meant for the future, and about the Titan who kept quietly making that future larger than the gods above had ever intended it to be. And so, in retaliation for the trick, and in a fury that had been waiting, perhaps, for exactly this excuse, Zeus made a decision meant to put mortal humankind firmly and permanently back in its place. He would take fire away from them. Not merely withhold some future gift. He would strip away the one resource they might have used to warm themselves, and cook their stolen meat, and forge tools, and build the beginnings of every civilization still to come. Without fire, humankind would remain forever exactly what it had been at the very start, cold and weak and dependent and small. Let them eat their meat raw, in the dark, Zeus decided and understand, in that darkness, precisely how little power they actually held in a world that belonged, always and only, to the gods above. And here, Prometheus made the choice that would define the whole rest of his existence, the choice from which every torment that followed would flow in a single unbroken line. He looked at the cold and fireless world Zeus intended to leave humankind trapped inside, and he decided, quietly and completely, that he would not allow it. He would give them fire anyway, in open defiance of the king of all the gods, knowing with total clarity, because clear sight was the one gift woven into his very name, exactly what the cost of that defiance would be. This is worth sitting with for a long moment, because it is the hinge on which the entire story turns. Prometheus was not ignorant of what he was risking. He was a Titan who had already fought and won one war by seeing the future, with perfect accuracy. There is no reading of this story in which he failed to understand that Zeus, having just decreed fire forbidden, would respond to its theft with the full and terrible weight of his fury. He knew. And he did it anyway, because the alternative, a world of shivering, half-fed, permanently diminished mortals, kept weak forever simply to satisfy one god's wounded pride, was, to him, a worse outcome than any punishment he himself might suffer for preventing it. So, in the dead of night, Prometheus climbed to the workshop of Hephaestus, the divine smith, where the sacred fire of the gods burned eternally on its hearth, and he stole a single spark of it and hid the spark inside the hollow stalk of a fennel plant, whose dry, pithy core could carry a smoldering ember a long distance without ever quite bursting into open flame and giving away his theft. And he carried that hidden spark down out of the halls of heaven, down through the long dark, all the way to the cold world of mortal men. And there, in the first hearth ever kindled by a Titan's stolen gift, he lit the fire that would become every fire mortals have ever known since, the flame that cooked their food and warmed their winters, and, in time, forged the bronze of their tools and the iron of their weapons, the flame from which the whole long unbroken chain of human invention would eventually spring. And that night, high on Olympus, Zeus looked down and saw the dark world of mortals glittering, suddenly, with 1,000 small orange lights, where there had been only cold blackness before. And he understood, in a single terrible instant, exactly what had been done, and exactly who had dared to do it. The rage of Zeus, when it finally broke, was not a small or ordinary anger. This was not simply a king punishing a servant for disobedience. This was the fury of absolute power confronted, for the first time since the war against the Titans, with a will it could not simply overwhelm or frighten into submission. For Prometheus, standing before him at last, did not deny the theft, and did not beg for mercy, and did not offer the easy, wilting apology that might, in another story, have softened a furious god's judgment. He stood, and he owned what he had done, and by every account that survives, he showed no fear at all, which, to a king unused to being defied, was perhaps the single most infuriating detail of the whole affair. And so Zeus devised a punishment, meant not merely to hurt Prometheus, but to break him, to demonstrate, once and permanently, exactly what happened to any being, Titan or mortal, who dared to place compassion above obedience to the throne of heaven. He commanded his own servants, Kratos and Bia, whose names mean strength and force, the grim and wordless enforcers of Olympian will, to seize Prometheus and drag him to the very edge of the known world, to the wild and unpeopled mountains of the Caucasus, at the furthest eastern rim of the earth. And there, with chains forged in Hephaestus's own furnace, the same furnace whose fire Prometheus had stolen, so that the very metal that bound him carried the bitter irony of his own gift, turned against him, the divine smith himself, weeping, the old tellers say, at the cruelty of the task, even as his hands obeyed it, drove great unbreakable spikes through the Titan's wrists and ankles, pinning him upright to the bare rock of the mountainside, arms spread wide, utterly exposed to sun and storm and wind, unable to move so much as an inch in any direction forever. And that alone, terrible as it was not the whole of the punishment. For an immortal cannot simply be killed and left to rest in death. An immortal's suffering once decreed must be sustained endlessly, or it accomplishes nothing at all. And so Zeus sent, each day, a great eagle, his own sacred bird, some tellings say, sired specially for exactly this purpose, to descend upon the chained and helpless Titan and tear open his side with its talons and beak, and feast upon his liver, the organ the Greeks believed, in their old medicine, to be the very seat of a person's passions and their courage. And because Prometheus was immortal, the liver could not simply be devoured once and be done with. It grew back each night, whole and unwounded, exactly as it had been, only so that the eagle might return with the dawn and tear it open all over again, day after day, night after night. No end written into the sentence at all, no term of years after which the punishment might be considered served, only the bare rock and the chains and the eagle's shadow crossing the sun each morning, and the long, unbearable wait through each night for the wound to close, so that it might be opened once more. Consider the particular horror of this punishment, and notice how carefully it was chosen. Zeus did not simply want Prometheus dead, which would have ended his suffering far too quickly and far too mercifully. He wanted him alive and aware and healing over and over, purely so that he could be wounded again. An infinite loop with no natural conclusion at all, broken only by whatever mercy or accident might one day intervene from outside it. It is among all the punishments the old myths ever devised, one of the very few built with no exit, built into its own design. Sisyphus, at least, has the illusion of nearly reaching the top of the hill each time before the boulder rolls away. Prometheus has nothing, only the eagle and the wound and the endless renewing of both. And here the deepest and strangest fact of the whole story asserts itself, the fact that separates Prometheus from every other sufferer in the old myths we have followed on this channel. He could have ended it, not through escape and not through any weapon or trick of his own. He was pinned too completely for either, but through a single act of speech. For buried deep in the long memory of a Titan who had, after all, been forethought itself made flesh, Prometheus held a secret that Zeus, for all his power, did not possess, a piece of knowledge about the future so dangerous that it could unmake the entire Olympian order. In a single stroke, the very same order Zeus had built upon the ashes of the Titans he had overthrown. It concerned a sea goddess named Thetis. Zeus, like his own father before him, and his father's father before that, had a habit of seeking out the world's most desirable women, mortal and divine alike. And Thetis, beautiful and gifted, had for a time drawn his eye as fiercely as any woman ever had. And it was Prometheus, chained, tormented, and by every outward measure entirely without power, who alone knew the one fact that could save Zeus from a catastrophe of his own making. There was a prophecy bound up in Thetis's fate, an old and unbendable law of destiny, that any son she bore would grow to be greater than his own father. Should Zeus himself father that son, the child would, in the fullness of time, do to Zeus exactly what Zeus had once done to Cronus, and Cronus had once done to Uranus before him. The same ancient and endlessly repeating pattern, playing itself out yet again, only this time with the king of all the gods himself, cast in the role of the father about to be overthrown. Zeus did not know this. He knew only that some prophecy hung, unspecified and threatening, somewhere over his pursuit of the sea goddess, and he suspected, correctly, that the one being in all creation who could tell him its exact and saving shape was the very Titan he had chained to a mountain and set an eagle to devour for eternity. And so, the god who had inflicted the punishment found himself, in a reversal almost too neat for irony, dependent on the very prisoner he had tormented for the one piece of knowledge that could secure his own throne. Zeus sent his messenger, swift Hermes, up to the mountain to offer Prometheus a bargain. "Speak the secret," Hermes told him. "Name the woman Zeus must avoid, and the chains will be struck away, and the eagle will never darken this sky again, and you will be restored to every honor you once held among the gods." It was, on its face, an extraordinary offer. Full freedom, full restoration, an end to a torment that had already stretched across ages of mortal reckoning, purchased for nothing more than a single sentence, spoken aloud. And Prometheus, chained to the rock with his side still healing from the eagle's last visit, refused. He mocked Hermes, by some of the old tellings, calling him little more than a servant sent to run errands for a frightened master, and told him plainly that he would rather endure every torment Zeus could ever devise, forever, than trade away knowledge that might save the very throne that had ordered his torture in the first place. Hermes warned him that his defiance would only make the punishment worse, that Zeus, in his rage at the refusal, would send storms to shake the very mountain from beneath him, and open the earth to swallow him down into deeper darkness still, and that even after all of that, the eagle would return unrelenting to begin the whole cycle again. Prometheus, the old plays tell us, simply answered that he had known all of this already, long before Hermes ever climbed the mountain to say it, for foreknowledge was the very thing he was named for, and that, knowing the future in perfect detail had never once, in his whole existence, been the same thing as being frightened by it. There is something worth pausing on in that answer, something that reaches far beyond this single myth. Prometheus was not defiant because he failed to understand the cost of his defiance. He was defiant precisely because he understood it completely, in full and total detail, and chose it anyway, with his eyes entirely open, which is, perhaps, the only kind of courage that ever actually matters, the kind that sees the whole coming storm and steps forward into it regardless. Time, in that punishment, moved differently than it moves for mortals, and the old accounts differ wildly on exactly how long Prometheus hung upon that rock. Some say a mere handful of generations, others say 30,000 years, an eternity folded into a single ongoing present of sun and wind and the eagle's returning shadow. But in the long, unbroken stretch of it, one visitor came to him, whose own suffering, though of an entirely different shape, seemed to answer his, in a strange and haunting way. Her name was Io, and she had once been a beautiful mortal priestess, desired by Zeus exactly as Thetis would one day be desired, and transformed, when Zeus's own jealous wife, Hera, grew suspicious, into the shape of a white heifer, cursed to wander the whole width of the earth, tormented ceaselessly by a biting gadfly that Hera sent to pursue her, never resting, never able to lie down, driven onward across mountain and desert and sea by a pain that never once let her stop moving long enough to grieve her own transformation properly. She came, in her wandering, to the foot of the very mountain where Prometheus hung chained, and looking up she saw a fellow prisoner of the same implacable power that had ruined her own life, and she begged him, if he could see the future as it was said he could, to tell her whether her torment would ever end. And Prometheus, unable to move so much as a finger to comfort her, gave her instead the one gift a chained prophet still had left to offer, the truth. He told her of the long road still ahead of her, the seas she would cross, and the strange lands she would pass through before her wandering was finally done. And he told her, too, of what waited at the very end of that impossibly long road, that after generations beyond counting, a descendant of her own bloodline, born far in the future, would come to this very mountain and would be the one to finally strike the chains from Prometheus's wrists, ending a torment that had already outlasted every mortal kingdom then standing. It is a strange and beautiful detail, easy to pass over quickly and worth holding on to instead. Two prisoners of the same distant power meeting for one brief moment at the foot of a mountain, one cursed to wander without rest, one cursed to be still without relief. And in that meeting, the wandering one is given, as her only comfort, the knowledge that her own descendants, generations she would never live to see, would one day be the ones to end the other's suffering. Moved on, still driven by the gadfly, still weeping, but carrying with her now something she had not had before, the knowledge that her long and painful road led somewhere, that it connected, however distantly, to a purpose larger than her own grief. And Prometheus, watching her go, returned to his waiting for the eagle, comforted, perhaps, by nothing more than the simple fact that he had, even chained and bleeding, still found a way to be of use to someone. The centuries wore on, and the punishment continued exactly as it had always continued. Sun and eagle and healing wound, and eagle again, and the throne of Olympus, that Prometheus's silence had been protecting all that time, remained, generation after generation, entirely secure, precisely because he had never once spoken the name of the woman Zeus needed to avoid. But there came, eventually, two intersecting threads that would finally, after so unimaginably long a wait, bring the story to its close. And it is worth noticing that neither thread arrived as a reward for Prometheus's suffering exactly, but rather as the slow, patient working out of things that had been set in motion long before by entirely different hands. The first thread was Heracles. In the long course of his own famous labors, the same 12 labors we have followed on this channel before, the lion and the hydra, and the long road to the very edge of the world, Heracles came in pursuit of the golden apples of the Hesperides to the same wild Caucasus mountains, where Prometheus still hung, and seeing the chain tighten and the eagle descending yet again for its endless meal, Heracles, who had never in his life been able to walk past a suffering creature without doing something about it, drew his great bow and shot the eagle from the sky, and then, with his own bare hands, tore away the chains that had held Prometheus fast, for longer than any mortal memory could properly reckon. There is a quiet and fitting symmetry in this rescue, worth pausing on. It was Heracles, the very same hero whose whole life, as we have followed it, was itself one long penance for a single terrible act. A hero who understood, better than almost any other figure in these old tales, exactly what it meant to suffer for something beyond one's own control, and to keep enduring anyway, who was finally the one to end another sufferer's endless torment. Some tellings say Zeus himself, by this point, was ready to allow it, that ages of watching Prometheus endure without ever once breaking had worn away enough of the old fury that the king of gods no longer objected to his release, so long as the freeing came, at last, by another's hand, and not by any softening of his own. Whatever the exact permission behind it, the chains came away. the eagle troubled him no more. But there was a second threat as well, and it belongs to another figure entirely, one whose own suffering had run, quietly, alongside Prometheus's own for years without either story fully touching the other, until this moment. His name was Chiron, and he was no ordinary centaur, but the wisest and gentlest of his whole wild kind, tutor to a long line of the greatest heroes of the age, a healer whose knowledge of medicine had no equal among mortals or immortals alike, and, unlike almost every other creature of his kind, he was immortal, a gift of his divine parentage that should, by every ordinary reckoning, have promised him an eternity free from death's reach. But in the very same campaign, on the very edge of an entirely different story we have already followed on this channel, Heracles had once loosed an arrow tipped in the black venom of the Hydra, and in the chaos of that ancient battle, the arrow struck Chiron by accident, meant for no one, least of all for the gentlest and wisest centaur alive. And because the Hydra's poison was beyond even Chiron's own legendary skill in medicine to cure, the wound would not heal, and the good centaur was left to suffer an agony with no end in sight, made crueler, not kinder, by his own immortality. For death itself, the one relief that might have ended the pain, was the one thing his divine nature would not permit him. Here, then, were two beings in two entirely separate corners of the same vast mythic world, each bound to a suffering that could not naturally end. One chained and devoured daily by an eagle, the other burning endlessly with a poison no cure could touch. And it was Chiron, hearing somehow of Prometheus's long ordeal, who offered the exchange that would finally free them both. He asked the gods to allow him to give up his own immortality, to trade the eternal life that had become, for him, an eternal wound, in place of the Titan's endless punishment, so that Chiron might finally be permitted to die, and rest, and end his own suffering at last, and Prometheus, in the same stroke, might be granted the one thing his own immortal nature had always denied him, an ending. It was granted. And so, by the strange and roundabout mathematics of these old myths, one being's mercy became another being's freedom, and a wound that never should have happened at all, an arrow gone astray in an unrelated war, became, in the fullness of time, the very thing that finally closed the door on a torment that had outlasted every mortal empire then standing. His freedom won, Prometheus is said, by some of the old accounts, to have gone at last to Zeus and spoken, finally and freely, the secret he had guarded through every century of his chains, not because the torment had broken him into speaking, for it never did, but because the danger had, by then, resolved itself in its own time, on its own terms, in a manner that owed nothing at all to Zeus's threats, or to any weakening of Prometheus's own will. Thetis, warned away, was given instead in marriage to a mortal man, a good and worthy king named Peleus, exactly so that the son destined to surpass his own father would be born mortal and would live and die as a man rather than ever threatening the throne of Olympus at all. That son, born of Thetis and Peleus, would grow to become the greatest warrior of an entire age, mighty in a way no ordinary mortal had ever been mighty, fated to win eternal glory at the cost of an early death beneath the walls of a distant and doomed city, a story this channel has already told in full, though its true beginning, it turns out, lay all along chained to a mountain in the far Caucasus, in the silent, unbreakable will of a Titan who would rather be eaten alive, night after night, for 30,000 years, than hand a tyrant the one secret that might have let him rule forever unchallenged. Every throne on Olympus, every kingdom of gods that came after, and even the whole terrible glory of the Trojan War itself, rested, when you trace the thread back far enough, on the silence of a single chained prisoner who refused, for longer than any mortal history has ever recorded, to speak. And so we return, at the very end, to the question we began with. Why would anyone choose an eternity of being devoured over a single sentence that would end it? The answer, traced across the whole long arc of this story, is not that Prometheus lacked the ordinary desire for relief, or that suffering had somehow stopped touching him after enough centuries of repetition. It is that he understood, with the same clear and unflinching sight that had named him at his very birth, exactly what kind of world his silence was protecting, and exactly what kind world his surrender would have permitted instead. To speak the secret would have secured Zeus's throne against every future challenge, forever, would have handed absolute and unchallengeable power to the very god who had already shown, in the chaining of Prometheus himself, exactly how he wielded power when nothing stood in its way. Prometheus's refusal was never simply stubbornness for its own sake. It was the last act of the same compassion that had started the whole story in the very beginning, back when a Titan looked at cold, trembling, unprotected mortals and could not bring himself to leave them that way. He had already paid an unimaginable price once, for the sake of beings who could never repay him and barely even understood what he had given up on their behalf. And when the moment came to choose between his own relief and the shape of the world that relief would help to build, he made, without hesitation, exactly the same choice all over again. There is something in that pattern worth carrying quietly away from this story, long after the mountain and the chains and the eagle have faded from memory, that the truest measure of a soul is not what it is willing to give when giving costs nothing, but what it is still willing to withhold, and to suffer for withholding when giving in would be so very easy, and so very tempting, and would ask of it, in that one unbearable moment, only a single small sentence, spoken once and never spoken of again. Rest now. Let the long night close gently over that far mountain, where the chains have fallen away at last, and the eagle troubles the sky no longer, and a Titan who gave the world its fire finally, after every age of the world had passed him by, is permitted simply to rest.